have you seen a person's life be ruined in a single day? Story 1. We had extended family together for a holiday, and everyone was making jokes about how my cousin was late. His mom and dad were involved in the jokes, texting him being upset about how he was late and all. Turns out, someone hit him in a head-on collision on his way over and he died on impact. The police knocked on the door to notify the family like a fucking movie. I'll never forget watching the family crumple to the ground. Story 2. An 18-year-old tried to steal a couple bottles of Hennessy from my store. When I confronted him, he swung the bottle at my head and connected. I rolled with the blow so it didn't do much damage. Charged with assault and robbery by my company. Violent crimes offender and lost custody of his baby. Edit. Guess I should have said the company I work for instead of my company, as I am no owner, lol. Story 3. I was working in a bank. One day, the director fired one of his executives. The whole, "empty your desk, you're fired" speech in front of everyone. The director was furious, and the guy seemed entirely destroyed. Then he explains to all that this guy gave his login and password to a friend in another branch. The friend used that login, and others, while doing some kind of credit card fraud. Police arrested her, but lacked evidence against the fired guy. So they just fired him on the spot. Obviously, besides losing his job, he was also blacklisted to work in banks or finance. Story 4. I play poker. I once saw a man on my way in betting about 10K, all on one roulette spin. He chose red and lost. He looked defeated. Later that night, a guy at our table told us that he heard the guy on the phone crying in the parking lot, trying to explain to his wife that he lost their money. She was screaming and said she wants a divorce. Story 5. A kid I went to school with and his sister died in a car crash. They were in the car behind the parents' car driving the older sister to her first year of college. Parents made a turn and no longer saw the kid's car behind them. I would say finding both your kids dead is up there. Two cars. Kid's car behind the parents' car. On a, if I recall the stretch, 2-lane highway. Story 6. My neighbor knocked on the front door early one morning. We'd never met. He introduced himself and wanted me to know why there might be a lot of cars parked in front of the house. All 3 of his children had died in a car accident the night before. Story 7. One of my friends was playing online with me when I hear a knock on his door through the mic. His parents walk in and decide to tell them that he is adopted and that they are getting a divorce. All in one go. No emotional breaks or anything, and my friend just breaks down over the mic as his parents walk out. Story 8. Yep. At least several times a month we had to take care of a family who learned that their child had cancer that day. Pretty terrible life-altering news. I spent a lot of time distracting kids with board games, coloring, while their parents were talking to doctors, crying, and then amazingly pulling it together to continue on. Story 9. I knew a guy who, within the same 24 hours, learned that his wife of 7 years was pregnant with someone else's child. His wife was filing for divorce, and she was going to try to get their house to herself because she was the primary signer on their mortgage because his credit wasn't so hot. That was brutal to see. Fucking A. Story 10. A girl in my class got caught with a thermos full of vodka, and when the teacher caught her, she got sent to the principal's office. Well, when the principal asked her why she was drinking, the girl told him that she had been sleeping with the school resource officer. Dude was a cop stationed at the school having with a 10th grader. Got dragged out of the school by officers that worked alongside him. At the court hearing, they found out he was having with 2 more girls at the school. His wife and 2 kids were in the courtroom to support him because he told them he was innocent. That kind of caved when one of the girls had a video of the 2 of them having. Story 11. When I was about 13, I was talking with my best friend at a playground on a hill. Suddenly, this lady comes racing down on her bike. She's not wearing a helmet, which was unfortunate because her bike slipped from underneath her, and she goes flying, smacks her head into a corner. I was too young to know this at the time, but I'm almost certain she died instantly. Wear a helmet. Story 12. Yup, and I did it. Boss had and produced Kitty. It disturbed me so much I spoke with a friend who was a desk SGT the town over and asked what could be done. He passed word along to the chief of the town where it was happening. 2 days later, the biggest cop I've ever seen walked through the door of our shop and asked to see everyone's ID, cuffed and stuffed. You should have seen his face when I was summoned to testify at the grand jury hearing. Edit. This whole thing has been sort of cleansing for me. I've never spoken about it to anyone other than my wife, who supported my decision to become a jobless college student with a family and mortgage. Thanks for the honest and kind words. The most important edit. Those of you saying I'm a hero. I'm just a person. The real heroes in this thread are the ones that lived through situations like this and continued on. Maybe reach out to some of them and ask if they're okay. Let them know that they are important, respected, and most of all, a valued member of our community. I keep getting asked how I found out, and I've answered it on a few occasions and got a bit rude to one individual. Apologies. I was approached by the victim and they asked for help. I helped. Story 13. This was a few years ago. I work in a hospital. Got notified a large trauma was coming in. A minivan got struck by a drunk driver with the grandpa, aunt, and 3 kids under 10. The aunt survived. The kids came to my hospital, 1 dead on arrival and the other 2 we couldn't save. Kept them on life support until the parents got there to say goodbye. I'm always going to remember the sound of the mom singing to them. She lost all her kids and her dad in one day. Story 14. Have a friend whose boss got into a gnarly car accident a week ago. Today she was officially told she's paralyzed from the waist down. She was also notified today that her husband died. Non-car accident related. I don't know exactly why he passed, but to go from a happy life with your soulmate to not being able to walk and have your life partner is something I can't imagine recovering soon from. Story 15. My stepdad's life was ruined the day his son, my brother, died. He couldn't cope with the loss, couldn't comprehend the rest of us were hurting just as bad, and turned even deeper into the alcohol and became even more emotionally abusive. Couple years later, when he forced my mom to choose him or me, I watched her make the hardest decision I've probably ever seen her make. She walked away from her husband, the love of her life. Edit. My mother and I no longer have much of a relationship. She made the right choice for the wrong reason. She has point-blank told me she regrets having me. My stepdad is, as far as I know, still drunk off his and living alone. My mother is alone and living with regrets. As for me, I'm still healing from the scars but mostly doing okay. Edit 2. I am still processing my mother's words. I do not take the blame she tried to place on me. I do not feel that I am a mistake. I know that her feelings or problems are not my fault. I know I am here for a reason, even if I don't know what it is. Story 16. I had a former colleague who was doing his residency in general surgery. He had just started his 5th and final year of training. One day, in the middle of a surgical case, the police show up at the hospital for him. A tech pulled him out of the OR, and he was arrested right there on the spot in front of everybody, still in most of his surgical attire. He had to do the walk of shame through the entire hospital, in handcuffs and OR scrubs. Turns out his ex-wife had gone to the police claiming that he had molested their children. The children testified to this effect as well. All of us were blown away. This was the sweetest, most cheerful guy ever. Nobody thought him capable of something like this. Sure enough, it came out several months later that the kid's statements were coerced and that his ex-wife falsified the whole thing. It wasn't the first time she'd attempted to screw him over, but it was definitely the most successful. Dude's career and life were fucked. Story 17. Doing an MRI on a 33-year-old healthy man because he was a bit dizzy and finding a golf ball tumor in his brain. Read the radiology report, Googled type of tumor, finding only 5% survive. Edit. I should also say that I do a lot of 30-something-year-olds who come in for head issues, and almost every single one of them are fine. Story 18. I grew up best friends with my sister, and one day she didn't come home from work. I was 16 at the time. She was 22. I heard my parents start to rumble around the house, turning the lights on, and I could hear more commotion and panic. The cops had called our house because they found my sister's car damaged on a street in the middle of a neighborhood with the driver's side door still open. And they found one of her shoes was in the middle of the street. The next morning, still no sister. She worked as a bartender. She left work that night and some guy followed her, sideswiped her car, and when she got out to swap insurance, he kidnapped her and put her in his truck and drove off. And that night continued to rape and abuse her and held her captive through the night and into the next day. My sister managed to escape that next day and run to the nearest house, banging on the doors. The homeowners let my sister in and called 911. They could tell she had been beaten and attacked. She was taken to the hospital, which is when we got the phone call where she was. She had 2 broken ribs, her face was nearly black and blue, both black eyes, and scratches all over her body. After that, I've never had my sister back. She survived the attack, but she suffers horrible anxiety and panic attacks. She can't go out in public alone. She drinks heavily and is terrified to move out of my mom's and live alone. IDK, I just used to look up to her and we would laugh and watch movies and bounce on the trampoline and she would drive me to try local food chains and we would listen to music and ever since I've never had my big sister back. I'll always love her, but it breaks my heart. In one day, her life changed for the worst. Story 19. I was part of a notification team that told a mother that her 20-year-old son had died. Watching her collapse, I know that her life would never be the same after that. Story 20. I'm sober, 6 years. There was a guy who used to attend meetings in my circle who picked up a drink on a Friday after being sober for more than 2 decades. They found him in the bay on Monday morning. Story 21. When I was in EMT school, we were told about a paramedic student, instructor was a paramedic as well, who observed a stabbing call. They arrive at the bar and see a dude with a knife in his abdomen. Medic student takes lead and pulls the knife out. Something you never do, as I'm sure you know. Senior medic loses his fucking mind at this, asking him what the he was thinking. Student freaks out and, you guessed it, puts the fucking knife back in. The patient died as a result. Student lost any chance of having a good job, not even just in EMS, and was charged with the death of the patient. Might have been manslaughter, I don't remember. His entire life was ruined because he freaked out and made a mistake on a call. Not a rookie mistake or a common slip-up, but in about half a minute he ruined his life. Story 22. Coworker got caught stealing and got fired. He went home and told his wife, and apparently she had enough and left him and took the kids. Police found him the next morning in the woods deceased. I saw a man's life just crumble in less than 24 hours. Edit, okay for some context. When I say steal, I mean close to $100,000 in precious metals from a cushy federal government job. Edit 2. He was going to be arrested and knew it. Also, he killed himself for everyone asking. Story 23. My elderly father unwittingly married a woman who would abuse him for 4.5 years before we found out. We met her on the day of the wedding. That day sealed his fate. She isolated him from us, coerced him to sell his assets, stripped his bank accounts, heavily drugged him, and almost killed him. But we rescued him, and he lived with us until he died. Story 24. Not my personal experience, but a national news story. A van full of college students got into an accident and most of them died, but one girl survived with major injuries. She had facial trauma and was hospitalized for weeks. She kept repeating another girl's name as she was recovering. Turns out, she was saying her own name. She and another similarly built, same hair and eye-colored female passenger were mistakenly identified for each other in the aftermath of the crash. Her family had a funeral for her, and the other girl's family were the ones at her bedside before the misidentification was realized. I cannot even imagine the suffering of thinking your daughter was alive for weeks and then learning she'd been dead all along. Or having a funeral for a child who was actually alive and you didn't know. Story 25. This was back in junior high school. Dude sent his nudes to an 8-year-old, him being 12, and the school found out. The cops were involved and they pulled up to the school and he left in handcuffs. It also turned out that same 8-year-old that he sent nudes to, he beat her into a coma. Don't know what happened to him. Obviously, he had some sort of assault and child pornography charges, but that's all I know. Story 26. I work as a registered nurse in a hospital in Kentucky. A patient came in through the ER raising and yelling things like, I want to donate my organs, this place sucks, fuck all of you, etc., etc. He stomped out the front ER entrance and a CNA, nurse's assistant, followed him out to attempt at calming him down. He brandished a .45 and blew his brains out in front of the young assistant. He died. Organs couldn't be harvested. And she is in therapy. Story 27. Watched a mom and her kid on a boat escorted by law enforcement back to the dock. Her boyfriend had gone swimming off the boat. The wind pushed the vessel away from him. She didn't know anything about how to turn it on to move it closer. It kept getting farther. He kept swimming harder. He eventually slipped under and was recovered 80 feet down a few days later. I'll never forget the look on her face. Never. He was a 28-year-old airman. Peak health. Wear a life jacket, people. You are not stronger than Mother Nature. And don't leave a boat without someone who can drive it safely. Story 28. One day during my junior year in high school, back in the 1980s, I came downstairs on a Saturday morning and my mom asked me, "Do you know Bob Johnson?" I said, "Yeah, I sit next to him in English." She turned the local newspaper around and there was Bob on the front page in handcuffs. He had murdered his dad and tried to cover it up. Apparently, his dad had been raping him for years, and Bob finally had enough. Shot his dad in the head with a .22 while he slept. Fortunately, the courts were lenient. They gave him a new identity, moved him out to somewhere in the Midwest, and gave him counseling. I guess this one day ruined his dad's life and saved his own. I saw him on Facebook a couple of years ago. He's using his real name, is married with kids, and working as a driver for one of the big parcel delivery services. I'm so glad his life turned out pretty normal. Shh, not his real name. Story 29. One of the former anesthesiology residents in the program here was in his last CA3 year. He was emergency call, which comes after C1, C2, and C3, and basically never ever calls in, but you have to be available in the event that you do get called in. Most people will sleep with their phone on, or go out to the movies, or do basically anything within a 30-minute drive of the hospital. Some crazy car accident happens that night around 2 a.m., and multiple trauma cases are going back into the OR. Our dude fell asleep and his iPhone did some automatic updates so he didn't get the call from the hospital immediately. His pager battery also died sometime that evening. He doesn't realize any of this until he's getting ready for work the next day at around 5:45 a.m. and sees his phone blown up. Shows up to work at 6, fired on the spot. Guy was 2 months away from graduation and starting salary of $400K a year plus overtime. Story 30. When I was a kid, I lived in an apartment complex. One of the families had 3 young kids. One day, the parents needed to run some errands, so they hired a babysitter to watch the kids. The babysitter fell asleep, and one of the kids started playing with some matches. The parents came home to huge billowing clouds of smoke and fire coming from all the windows. All 3 kids and the babysitter died. They were only gone for about an hour. Story 31. Like 7-ish years ago, a bunch of the crew chiefs at my guard base were out celebrating one of their own who got his associate's degree. They were all drinking, not a ton, and eventually went home. Except for one guy. He stayed and drank until last call. He decided to drive home. He hit a 20-year-old who was on his way to work at about 2 a.m. and turned him into a paraplegic. Our wing commander basically told him plead guilty to the county and go to jail with an administrative discharge. His family would have been able to keep some of his benefits like the VA loan and GI Bill. Or fight it, lose, cost his family tons of money, and get a dishonorable. Dishonorable basically is like you never even served. He plead guilty. Edit. Dishonorable like you never served in regards to benefits. Any bonuses you received you have to pay back. Medals are rescinded. It is also listed on job applications, and people will deny you because of it. I know a dishonorable is like a felony, but to do it is a long process, regardless if he got convicted in civilian criminal court. His discharge was a, hey, you still have 2 years left in your contract before re-enlistment, so you're just going to resign that right now instead. Also, to the people who think that he got away scot-free, he didn't. He went to jail. Felony DUI and assault with a deadly weapon or something like that. The wing commander only allowed him to do at least one selfless thing and still be able to transfer his GI Bill and VA loan to his family. He also had to pay medical expenses for the kid he hit, and probably other damages as well, so it's not like he got a free pass on that. Story 32. 3 weeks after graduating from high school, honor student got drunk at a party and put a knife in another guy's chest. Didn't kill him, but it was a close call. Goodbye, adulthood. Story 33. Chris Watts? Dude annihilated his entire family, probably thinking he wouldn't get caught. If you ever have some free time, go on YouTube and watch the police officers' body cams working that case. Story 34. When I was 7, my father came home from work and told my mother he wanted a divorce. He grabbed a suitcase and packed some things while my mother alternated between crying, trying to cook dinner for me and my brother, and screaming at him that he was insane. She had no idea where this was coming from, and she would change the locks if he left. He did leave, and she did indeed change the locks the very next day. She went from a homemaker to a single mother the next day, and our standing of living fell immensely. I don't think she ever recovered from the stress of the divorce and trying to raise us on her own. Thinking about what a kind, smart, and wonderful person my mother is and how my father basically ruined her life when she was only 32 makes me really sad. She just wanted to have kids and then go back to work when we were both in grade school so she could be a teacher like she wanted to. But the divorce killed that dream. We became latchkey kids in a bad neighborhood while she had to work in call centers or in hotel housekeeping because Being a teacher didn't pay enough or give her enough time off to take care of us. I became a surrogate mother for my baby brother when my mother worked long hours. It was a culture shock, to say the least. I remember going to therapy, which I now know was court-ordered because my mom wanted to have sole custody, so she had to have us evaluated to prove that my dad wasn't up to task of sharing custody throughout the divorce proceedings, and counselors telling me over and over that it was going to be okay, that my parents still loved us and we'd still go to the same school and have the same life we would have. I didn't believe them at the time, and I was right to. Our lives derailed entirely that single day. I'm okay, so is my brother. But my mother gave all of her health and the best years of her life to raising us in thankless circumstances, while my father failed to pay child support and came around only enough to avoid a bench warrant or to prevent my mom from gaining sole custody and increasing his support obligations. It makes me bitter to see him happy now, and my mother in poor health when she's 2 decades too young to have the health problems of an 80-year-old. Related, my grandmother became our second mother in the wake of the divorce. The stress of that killed her as well. You can track pictures of her from about 55 when my parents got divorced and how young and beautiful she was. Then you look at pictures of her in her 60s and she looks haggard. She died of cancer in her early 70s. I blocked out the memories of those early days for a long time. I've only recently done the heavy lifting of trying to dig up the emotions and events of my life from age 7 to about 14. I honestly remember little to nothing. Traumatic memory is wild. Pursuant to my goal of trying to support my mom. Partially because she deserves it, partially because I don't want her to meet the same fate as my grandmother. It's weird to think about how I wouldn't be on the hook for my mom's failing health now. I could have had a happier childhood, and my mom could have had a better life, and my grandmother might not be dead. Had my dad just decided not to be a miserable fucking that day and all the days thereafter. Story 35. I used to work in a casino just after high school. It was in a suburb of a larger city, but basically the first one you can get to when coming in from the north of the province. A lady was crying at one of the slot machines. Apparently, she was on her way into the city to go to the big mall and get Christmas gifts for her kids, our family, but lost all the money before she got to the mall. She lost a bit at first, then the rest trying to get the first bit back. Story 36. The first one that pops to mind is one of my coworkers arriving at work sobbing hysterically. It took a while to calm her down to the point where we could understand anything she was saying. I thought she must have been robbed or something, but it turned out she'd just found love letters in her car, from her mother to her husband. All I could think was that A, if that were me, the last thing I'd do is show up to work and tell everybody, and B, I'd probably drive off a cliff. Or, I don't know, murder my husband? How do you ever recover from that? I mean, if my husband was just having an affair with a chick or another man, I'd just divorce him. But my mother? I could not even. I still think about that. Poor girl. She was such a nice person and did not deserve that. Edit. They were having an affair. It wasn't just that the mom was infatuated and writing to him. Story 37. My dad used to work at Prudential Financial, and he told me that in the days after Enron's stock suddenly dropped to nothing, some of his coworkers just walked around like zombies. Apparently, they'd put a ton of money into Enron, and were now completely screwed. Story 38. When I was like 9 or something, a boy from my class was killed by his mother before she committed suicide. I saw it on the news that night, only to learn it was him the next morning. Story 39. I was a surgical intern, and there was a fourth-year med student, just 1 year behind me, on our general surgery team as an acting intern. Dude was an all-American in every sense. Extremely bright, tall and good-looking, charming to talk to, class president, etc. He was literally like Captain America, Steve Rogers incarnate. Wanted to be a general surgeon at my hospital, and all of my attending physicians were extremely fond of him. They already were talking about how great of a resident he would make and what to do when he was an intern. It was nearing the end of his rotation, and he was scheduled to do a routine surgery with the chair of the department, specifically so the chair could evaluate him and give him a letter of recommendation afterwards. The evening before his big day, he and I went over the steps of the procedure and the little quirks that the chair liked so he could impress the chair for a good letter. He left and we texted about some additional tiny details about the surgery later. Next morning, my chief tells me I need to scrub in for the surgery that the student was supposed to do because he hadn't showed up yet. I told a third-year medical student who was also on our team to go look for him because it wasn't like him to be late. This guy was militantly punctual. It was odd he'd be late on a day like this. About an hour into the surgery, my chief resident comes in and asks me to scrub out, and informs me that the student I had sent earlier had found him in his apartment, in a pool of his own blood, shot through the neck. None of his possessions were missing, and he had no clear enemies or reasons that someone might want him dead. Someone just broke in and shot him. I had trouble believing it. It was very bizarre and surreal. I was later questioned by a detective because I was technically the last person to communicate with him, via text. A few months later, they eventually caught the kids responsible a few states away. Apparently, it was some sort of gang initiation to kill a random person. And they got their due. But the whole ordeal left me in a funk for a while, because it was so completely random and senseless, and that kid had literally everything going for him. He was one of the really good ones. Story 40. I have an uncle who one day found his wife cheating on him with his best friend, only to be accused of molesting his daughters. And since the mother forced the girls to choose, they had to go along with the mom and lied on court he did the next week. He lost his best friend, his job at a high role in the military, lost his house and car during the divorce, gotten so much hate from his kids. He did not have a fun month or so until his daughter broke under the pressure and admitted lying. After that, the entire family, except the mom who won pretty much everything he owned, fell apart. Mom kicked out her child for betraying her. Kids left the house one after another, each to a different family member. Dad almost commits suicide. Mom continued fucking other guys and made her own kids and her ex-husband life into. Edit. English is hard. Story 41. There was a guy I had known in high school who was always kind of losery, but a friendly enough guy. Nice to talk to and all that. After high school, he became a heroin dealer and sold some stuff to his best friend. Unbeknownst to the dealer, it turned out to be tainted in some way. It killed his best friend since childhood. He will be in prison for a very long time. Story 42. My friend's husband produced and consumed child, including some photos of their children and nephews. She found out when DHS raided their apartment. It tore her life apart. She's doing well now, though. Divorced, obviously, and he no longer has any parental rights. She's still struggling to help her kids process the whole thing. Story 43. We were standing on a downtown corner watching 4th of July parade when we saw the parents of one of the players on a soccer team I coached talk to someone and began running like through the crowd with panic-stricken faces. Someone came to our door later and told us the Matt, their 10-year-old son, had jumped off a float to get some candy thrown by someone on another float and had tripped. The float he was on ran over his head, killing him. Our son was on the same float and hadn't gotten home yet. One of the most depressing moments in my life. The parents were never the same. The people on floats in our town never threw candy again. I think of Matt every 4th of July. Story 44. A guy that I worked with asked to have Friday night off as he was going out of town. Turns out he went to go meet with an underage girl he met on Craigslist that ended up actually being a giant police sting. He was arrested for soliciting a minor. That was probably 6 years ago, and the last I heard he was still locked up. Story 45. A really nice man who owned a gaming cafe here. A place with many computers connected on LAN where people go to play games together. Age 33. Has a wife and 2 kids. I know him. I used to frequent his place a lot. And one early morning I was going to his place to just play and stuff. The place was not open that morning, and his business partner was walking around asking where his partner was. I told him that I hadn't seen him that day. Turns out that his house was hit by a fucking missile. I live in Syria, so this is more common to me than most other people on this earth, but his home was burned and he and his children were killed. Worst part? His wife? A college professor, from what I was told, went to work that day before the missile hit. She was in the university when she lost her husband, her children, and her home. Everything she had gone in just one lovely Mediterranean morning. I don't know much about her. I just hope she's all right these days. Story 46. Edited to clarify and reply. Of course I am there 100% for her. She's been in my life for over 20 years, and we've seen each other through the best and worst of situations. But how am I supposed to prevent her from reaching her breaking point when she's literally lost the most important thing that she's ever known? Nobody can understand the utter devastation of watching your own child die because of a senseless act of violence unless they've experienced it. He was not involved with gangs in any way. This was not a targeted attack. It was not retaliation. He was not in possession of a weapon. There was no confrontation. He was merely sitting in the front seat of the car, his longtime girlfriend driving. She, too, is a fragile, sweet soul who had her life destroyed in the blink of an eye. He was a registered organ donor, and due to his absolute love of animals and people, was always a kind, giving kid. His mother instilled a great many beautiful attributes as she raised him, and his gift of precious organs has given the hope of a future to so many families. I appreciate the words of support and comfort, both in replies and private message. Thank you. On April 2nd this year, my best friend's son went to run a quick errand. Told her, be back soon. An hour later, she's wearing just her pajamas next to a hospital ER entrance, being told they cannot allow her inside due to a shooting victim's admittance and the subsequent mandated lockdown. Her son, the boy I knew from the moment he was born 19 years prior, was brain dead and on life support. He became an organ donor 5 days later. Didn't take even a minute, let alone a day, for her to lose her entire reason for breathing. She's ruined. And I'm dreading the moment she decides there's no point in going on. Because barring a miracle, it's inevitable. Story 47. Neighbor's house burned down when I was a kid. Watched the family cry helplessly outside as everything they owned went up in flames. On top of that, their dog was in the house and did not make it out. Story 48. A couple years ago around Christmas, I was staying with my cousins. We were up late watching movies when we hear a loud crash outside. We run out to see a truck on its side. I call 911 and head towards the truck. The neighbors were also making their way outside, and we go to help out the driver. We get him out, he reeks of alcohol, and starts asking if he can use my phone to call his wife. I let him use it and then tell him to go sit on the curb while the police gets here. He's Hispanic, and so am I, so we're talking in Spanish this whole time. He tells me to do him a solid and let him go, that his wife's on his way to pick him up. The cops arrive and I told them everything that happened. He had tried to walk away, but the other neighbors stopped him. Cops grabbed him and took him away. 20 minutes later, his wife calls my phone back asking for her husband, and I had to explain to her that her husband was drunk driving, crashed their brand new truck, and was currently in the back of a police vehicle. I felt horrible telling her all this, and still think about that conversation every once in a while. Story 49. My family. I woke up to the most horrifying screams. Never heard screams like that before, not even in the worst horror films. It was my mother after being told Dad had crashed his bike on the way back to base. I still have nightmares about them, and still break down about my father. It's been 15 years, but the man was my best friend and a great dad.